Today we're going to continue our discussion of reason with reason as man's means of survival and the arbitrary as neither true nor false. Stay tuned. Okay, so I have a confession to make, which is that I did not read ahead in OPAR. And so a lot of the stuff I covered in the last video on emotions actually belongs rightfully in this section of reason as man's only means of knowledge. And so I'm going to say a little bit about that, but then I'm going to go on to the issue of the arbitrary as neither true nor false. Now, good for me, the two are intimately related. That when we talk about reason as man's only means of knowledge, the contrast, the only other approach that's open to us is emotionalism. And so then in the arbitrary as neither true nor false, precisely the question we're going to be asking is, what is the cognitive status of claims based on emotion? So let's get started. Okay, so to summarize what Leonard Peikoff covers in the section Reason as Man's Only Means of Knowledge. So we start out with just a brief summary of emotions are automatized evaluations of whether things are good or bad for us. And those evaluations, the experience of feeling an emotion, the important aspect from the point of view of cognition, of understanding the world, is they have no independent means of assessing their own relationship to reality. This is something we talked about last time, that having an emotion, you can't through emotion determine, is this emotion connected to reality or not? Does it stand in the right relationship to the facts? And yet that is emotions are the only alternative to reason that's ever been offered. Every form of revelation or ESP or any of these forms of knowing outside of reason amount to, I feel that it's true. And so that that the only means of grasping reality or only faculty of awareness is reason. And it's precisely for the reasons that we've talked about through objectivity and everything else in the book, is that reason is the faculty that's grounded in our direct awareness of reality through perception, that it works through concepts that are connected to reality for all the reasons we've talked about, and that the method is logic, which is taking the basic principle of reality and of knowledge, which is the law of identity, and using it to connect the conceptual level to the directly given percepts. And that's what keeps us grounded in facts. And so therefore, when you're engaged in a process of cognition, you have to set emotions aside and go exclusively by reason. And that this is not an anti-reason, or I'm sorry, this is not an anti-emotion view. It's not saying emotions are bad or anything like that. As we talked about, they are the form in which we experience our values. It is what gives us a life filled with enjoyment, pleasure, happiness, but that it's not tools of cognition. And Leonard calls it a division of mental labor. And I really like that. It's that it's crucially important, but it's just not how we get in contact with reality. And that the alternative to going exclusively by reason is emotionalism, putting ourselves in the grips of our feelings and not having any deliberate, willful contact with reality. And so that's going to set us up now to turn to, what do we make of claims based on emotion? So the one thing I want to talk about that comes up in this section that I didn't get to cover last time is a point Dr. Peikoff makes about the issue of emotionalism, that the essence of emotionalism is the I wish over the it is. And this is a formulation that Ayn Rand uses in many places, but it really comes out of Atlas Shrugged, and in particular Galt's speech, where we get that the kind of centrality of wishing. And I think this is one of the most pregnant ideas in objectivism. Now, it's a negative, so it's not, there's a reason that it's kind of covered very briefly in OPAR. But, I mean, even notice what Dr. Peikoff has to say about it. So, I mean, this is quoting from him. Epistemologically, this inversion means the rejection of objectivity. Metaphysically, it means the primacy of consciousness and thus the rejection of reality. Psychologically, it's what underlies the process of evasion. Ethically, therefore, it is the root of all evil. And I mean, so you can just see the massive integration that he's making with this concept of the I wish over the it is. And so I think it's something worth paying attention to. And just as a general matter, I really think that this is kind of funny to say, I don't think objectivists pay nearly enough attention to Galt's speech and don't study it nearly enough. And in particular, once it gets past kind of Ayn Rand's presentation of the positive and into her analysis of the morality of death and its roots in mysticism, and mysticism's ultimate root in the I wish over the it is, and then all the consequences that follow from there. And what part of the perspective that you get in Galt's speech that I don't think you get anywhere else, or not as strongly, is this total integration of the deepest, most fundamental issues in philosophy and their practical implications and importance. So if you think about what OPAR is doing, is here's a dispassionate presentation of the positive. This is the objectivist philosophy. One of the things that OPAR doesn't give you, or gives you in a way that's not fully stressed, because that's not Leonard's purpose, but that is super stressed in Galt's speech, is the practical import, the life or death importance of even the most abstract, fundamental, remote from daily life, if you want to put it that way, ideas in philosophy, or seemingly remote from daily life, ideas in philosophy. And what you see in Galt's speech is really the life or death stakes of even something like A is A. And so I'm just going to this is just one example, and this is part of where she's really delving into this idea of the I wish over the it is. And so this says, quote, "There is no honest revolt against reason, and when you accept any part of their creed," she's talking about the mystics, your motive is to get away with something your reason would not permit you to attempt. The freedom you seek is the freedom from the fact that if you stole your wealth, you are a scoundrel, no matter how much you give to charity or how many prayers you recite. That if you sleep with sluts, you're not a worthy husband, no matter how anxiously you feel that you love your wife the next morning. That you are an entity, not a series of random pieces scattered through a universe where nothing sticks and nothing commits you to anything, the universe of a child's nightmare where identities switch and swim, where the rodder and the hero are interchangeable parts arbitrarily assumed at will, that you are a man, that you are an entity, that you are. So we see how the objectivist metaphysics, or the rejection of them, of causality, of identity, of entity, of existence, are used to rationalize all manner of evil. And that is really the perspective that you get, is that ideas matter, and evil ideas are tools. They're not just like that. At least the core issues in philosophy, they're not just, all right, we made some mistakes, no big deal. It's, like maybe my paper won't get published in the next installment of metaphysics. It's that, no, these ideas are used, and they're used in daily life by people trying to put something really bad over. And so this kind of perspective is just like screams at you in Galt's speech. And it's in all of Ayn Rand's writings, but I think never in a more striking way than in Galt's speech. And so I really encourage everybody to study it, particularly if it's one of the things you kind of skip over, or there's parts of it that you skip over. It is so rich, and part of the richness is what I'm stressing is it's not just these are things that she later talked about in a nonfiction context. There's a lot there that she doesn't talk about that much in a nonfiction context. And even in the nonfiction context, and in Galt's speech, you get, I think, the fullest integration of the most fundamental principles of objectivism and their practical meaning and their practical importance. And so it's a tour de force to light a phrase. All right, so let's jump into the arbitrary is neither true nor false. So Leonard starts out with that we have widespread claims based on emotion, claims that are arbitrary, i.e. that have no evidence, no justification offered for them. And so the issue is, well, how do we assess these? Are they probable? Are they possible? Are they certain? Like, what are they false? What is the right way to categorize them? And what he argues is that the arbitrary is neither true nor false. It's to be rejected without consideration. And why is that? Well, it's precisely because there's nothing to consider. That what we've seen with objectivity is that to consider an idea is to relate it to reality by integrating it, reducing it, or trying to integrate and reduce it. But there's nothing to integrate or reduce with the arbitrary, is that there's no evidence offered, so there's nothing you can do with it cognitively, and so it's essentially like nothing has been said. And so it's to be rejected, it's to be dismissed, and it's not false, it's worse than false, because at least the false is an attempt to know reality, albeit a failed one, a one that went off the rails. The arbitrary is not an attempt to know reality, it's just purely based on emotion. Then he relates it to this issue of the onus of proof, and it's, if you're going to make an assertion, it's on you to provide evidence for it. It's not on me to prove it's not so. And that's the whole attitude of the person pushing the arbitrary, is they're not asking for you to say that it's true, but it's, hey, you can't disprove it. And what Leonard stresses is that no, if you're asserting if you want this to be considered, then you have to offer positive evidence for it. Otherwise, it's out. And so from this perspective, and the basic reason for that is that existence exists and only existence exists. So if something's not true, there's not like a fact that you can point to. Now, you can, in some cases, relate it to facts, but you can only do it from the perspective of a positive, of, well, I know this, and therefore that can't be true. So to take kind of a common sense example, it's like, I know Joe didn't kill Barry because Barry was killed in New York and I was with Joe in France during that time. So it's only, I know this, that allows me to say, therefore something else is not true. But you can't just prove a negative in a vacuum. And so then that gets to an issue of agnosticism, which is, it typically comes up in a religious context, but not only in a religious context. And objectivism's perspective is that agnosticism is wrong because it's granting mental status, cognitive status to the arbitrary. It's taking a claim that has no evidence based purely on emotion. It says maybe, but maybe means it's possible. It could be. It's an attempt to know. And that's precisely the sanction that the purveyors of the arbitrary are after. What they want is to be treated as people on a quest for truth. And from objectivism's perspective, that's precisely what they're not on a quest for. And so therefore, our attitude has to be that I'm going to dismiss this without consideration. And that's the end of the story. So I really want to underline this point that the arbitrary is claims based on emotion, because for one aspect of it is that you'll often get, when people are engaged in the arbitrary, they'll give reasons. It's rare that somebody will just be outright defiantly and openly arbitrary and say, I said it, that I'm not going to offer you reasons why, and you prove that it's not so. That's their perspective. That's really what's underlying what they're doing. But they'll offer all kinds of reasons. Like if you listen to an Alex Jones kind of conspiracist, or engage with religionists, they'll have arguments and they'll have, quote, evidence and things. And so it can take effort to see that what's going on is arbitrary. But what you ultimately see is that it's not the evidence that led them to their conclusion. It's that they have a conclusion based on emotion. And they'll just trot out any seeming evidence that they can come up with. And then if you shoot that down, they'll give you 10 more explanations. But it's ultimately coming from a place that they're not on a quest for truth. They're emotionalists who are trying to dress up emotionalism and make it respectable. And so it can take cognitive work to see that something's arbitrary, but once you see that it's arbitrary, then your attitude is, this is out. And one of the reasons I want to stress this is because if you only hold the arbitrary as, well, it's that for which there's absolutely no reasons given at all, then it will be, well, this seems kind of a weird, not very useful idea. Like, it's not very often that somebody just comes up and says, hey, there's gremlins reading Hegel on Mars, which I think is one of Leonard's examples. And Leonard's making a good point with that, but that's kind of an unusual sort of case. Whereas you should see the arbitrary everywhere, unfortunately. And as Leonard puts it, it's that the arbitrary claims are widespread. And to get that they're widespread, you have to see that there is a dressing up in the form of I'm offering reasons for it that goes on. but it's that it's not reasons that are being used in order to know reality. It's reasons to dress up emotionalism, and that's the real key perspective. So I want to talk about a common error that comes up in people who hear the objectivist view here and think that, no, this isn't right. And usually the kind of way that they're looking at it is we start with propositions, right? And you could even be something like there's gremlins reading Hegel on Mars. And then that's a proposition. And then what we do is figure out, okay, what does this correspond to reality or not? What's the relationship between this proposition and reality? It clearly has some, if we know the meaning of the terms, if the terms are actually meaningful, we know that it has some relationship to reality, and we just have to discover it. And so it's either false or it's true. And you couldn't have a category of arbitrary that wouldn't make any sense. And from objectivism's perspective, truth is a correspondence between propositions and reality. And Leonard talks about this and stresses this. But from the objectivist perspective, it's not propositions kind of out there in reality and they have some intrinsic relationship to reality. Propositions, and we talked about this a couple of videos ago, there are form in holding conceptual knowledge. It's a conceptual identification by a mind. And what truth, knowledge, any kind of cognitive status is, it's a relationship between a mind and reality. And you can't drop that out. And what the arbitrary is there is no relationship between this idea and reality, because the proposition, if you will, isn't even a proposition. It's a string of words that are issued by a mind that have no standing to reality because they're not made in an effort to know reality. And this is when Leonard gives the example of, words kind of blown into sand. It's that is the equivalent situation of somebody who's not looking at evidence, not trying to grasp reality by saying, what are the facts and what conclusions can we draw from the facts? But we're saying, the hell with the facts, to hell with trying to draw a conclusion from the facts. I'm going to start with a conclusion that I feel is true, or that I'm just going to assert because I want to assert is true, and you prove that it's not so. And so if you have that kind of view, then Leonard actually has a really good quote that I find helpful here. He says, there can be no correspondence or recognition. So if truth is correspondence to reality, a recognition of a fact, there can be no correspondence or recognition without the mind that corresponds or recognizes. So it's that our aim is a mind in contact with reality. And if somebody issues an arbitrary proposition, there's no relationship to reality. You can't bring that proposition into any standing, into any relationship to reality, because there's no evidence. There's nothing you can do cognitively. You can't reduce it. You can't integrate it. And so the only thing you can do is reject it and say, that is not an effort at knowing, and there's nothing I can do with it. I'm not considering it false, but I'm not considering it a maybe, a possible, or anything like that. It's out until there's actual evidence offered for it. All right, so that was a common error in regard to the arbitrary. Now I want to end with a discussion of an uncommon error, but one that I think is worth addressing. So in a recent discussion or debate that I had with the objectivist author Craig Biddle, I made a claim about what I saw or heard him say at a talk he gave, I think in 2004, 2005 at George Mason University. And Craig's response was that it was arbitrary. I didn't offer evidence that he really said these things. And so presumably it's, well, I didn't have it a tape or something like that. I don't know exactly what he would have expected. But this is definitely not the objectivist view of the arbitrary. So the objectivist view, remember we've talked about, it's a claim made in defiance of the need for evidence based on emotion. And personal testimony is precisely a kind of evidence. It is, I saw this, I heard this, and now I'm offering it to you. And if you just think, for instance, about Ayn Rand, a lot of what we know about Ayn Rand's life and her development come from her personal biographical interviews that she did with Nathaniel Branden and Barbara Branden. And so on the Craig Biddle view, no, all of that is out. That's arbitrary. Ayn Rand was not trotting out like her journals to prove, yeah, I was really 12 when I discovered thinking in principles, and here's my passport. I really was born in the Soviet Union. She was just telling us about what she experienced and thought during her life. And so, no, that's arbitrary. We can't consider it. We can't talk about it until somebody tracks down some supporting evidence. And that is all wrong. If you think about court cases, for example, I was on a jury in 2006, I think, and the 60% of the evidence was testimony. It was people saying, this is what I saw, this is what I heard. And it is evidence, and it's evidence precisely in that you can cognitively process it. Well, how do you process it? Here's how Harry Binswanger talks about this issue. So right after, in the section immediately after he talks about the arbitrary in How We Know, he says, the mere fact that someone has asserted something is not evidence for its truth. And then parentheses, testimony from a credible source about what he observed is fundamentally different from raw assertion. And then you get a footnote. In the case of another's testimony, the evidence one needs is not of the content of his report, beyond it being consistent with what you know, but of its credibility as a report, i.e., knowledge of the honesty, reliability, and accuracy of the reporter. The reporter, if thus qualified, is serving as your eyes and ears. That is why courts do not allow as testimony conclusions that a witness drew, but only the facts that he observed. And so that last point is really helpful. So in defamation law, there's kind of a distinction made between a claim like if I just wrote on my website, Joe is a crackhead, I could be sued for defamation, and that goes into a different category though than I saw Joe smoke crack on his porch yesterday. I saw him smoke crack on his porch the day before that. I saw him smoke crack on his porch the day before that, and the day before that, he was telling me how much he loves crack and does it all the time, and it's his favorite thing in the world. That one of those is arbitrary in effect. It's just a conclusion offered without evidence versus, no, this is the evidence. The evidence is these are things I saw and I heard. And now you can say, I don't believe this guy and he's not credible for these reasons and those reasons, but it's precisely, you're in the cognitive realm then. He's offering evidence and you can look at the evidence of his credibility. And so if you want to understand the arbitrary, you have to get that personal testimony is precisely the kind of thing that is you're able to process it. It's something that you can do something with cognitively in a way that you can't with claims based on emotion. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and hit that bell so you don't miss a single episode. And be sure to go to donswriting.com and sign up for the newsletter so that you can get up to date on everything I'm doing, including content that's not available anywhere else. Talk next time.